Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. It'll just be a few moments. Good morning, everyone. Just be another minute and we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sunnyvale Mayor Larry Klein, and thanks for joining me again this week. You know, this is our 45th installment of the weekly virtual office hour address, and people continue to say that they really appreciate these live stream addresses, hearing from their mayor. So I'll continue to do these while the shelter in place continues, and probably even longer than that. This live stream event is really great because it allows me to give you some updates, provide some words of encouragement, of course, really answer some of your questions. So if you have any questions, just put them into the comment section, and I'll answer them during the meeting, during the address if I can, or later if I don't get to your question. So, and thank you for allowing me to continue to represent you and work for Sunnyvale during these ever changing times. And it looks like we're finally getting some much needed rain. So stay warm. Definitely things are changing at a city level as far as that's concerned, but also importantly at the federal level. And we'll see how that affects definitely some funding that we've been looking for, and as well as what kind of new organization as far as getting the vaccines out to people and trying to get back to some sort of normal. So I hope everyone's staying healthy, doing well. Please remember to take care of yourself both physically and mentally. These are difficult times for so many of us. There's that general fatigue of staying home, but and we continue to see the surge in cases from the holidays. We're starting to at least see, I think, that trying to trail off. There's been an increase, but that increase is not as bad as it was a week ago. So keep following the county health orders. You can do your part to stop the spread of the virus. Wash your hands, don't touch your face. Um, Reduce the number of people that you come in contact with on a daily basis. Maintain safe social distance when you are out, and of course, wear your mask. It's important. It makes a difference. It really does help, and it's mandatory. So as I've said before, if you need a face covering, I still have some. It looks like everybody now has masks, and I'm happy to see that I do see people, almost everyone when I'm out, wearing one, even on a walk around the block. So, and that's a big thing when you could be a carrier, or someone you meet could be a carrier of the virus and be asymptomatic, not showing symptoms. And that's one of the main ways that people have been affected, that they're seeing somebody that doesn't show any signs of COVID, and instead is being and passing that on to them. So we're now 312 days, just about 10 months after the March 16th county health order started the shelter in place and attempted to basically slow the spread of COVID-19. Since that declaration, a lot has happened. More happens every day. I watch press conferences. I have seminars to attend, conference calls to confer and advocate on your behalf. So, I'm happy that things, that's one of the things that I'm able to do for Sunnyvale and for all of our residents. So let's go ahead and talk about what's happened at a federal, state, county, and city level over the last 2 weeks. So 2 weeks ago today, the Bay Area stay-at-home health order was scheduled, and this was the regional health order, was scheduled to end. But of course, the state extended that order indefinitely. And they also issued basically travel advisory for residents that if they're traveling more than 120 miles from their home, they should avoid that except for essential reasons. And then, if they're returning to the state, they need to quarantine for at least 10 days. So that was basically those changes. It didn't really affect our we're still in the regional order. And from that standpoint, things are not looking that much better from a regional health order. From our numbers remain about the same. It's went up and down, but still it's in the low 10. It's basically around 3 to 5% ICU availability over the last few weeks. And then Governor Newsom last week proposed over the last week and a half, 2 weeks, revealed basically his state budget. And so he released that, which basically announced his $4.5 billion stimulus program, that Golden Gate stimulus to help small businesses. It also, it gave a variety of grants and tax incentives that the legislation needs to basically approve in order for it to take effect. It also provided $600 additional payments for low-income California residents that earn less than $30,000 a year. And then he also proposed extending the state's eviction moratorium, which is set to expire on January 31st. But of course, that really requires the state legislature to take that up. And there are several bills going through the state legislature right now that will take on that. So, and hopefully the legislature will approve some of the funding. The good thing is the state's legislative analyst office estimated that the state budget would see about a $26 billion surplus in 2021 because the tax revenues have come in higher than expected during the pandemic. So the states, that requires, of course, the state legislators to approve additional funding. And a lot of that, and there was also funding in there for $2 billion going to schools, hoping that they would reopen in February, and we'll talk a little bit about that later today. But definitely, that's going to take a little bit to some negotiations from a state level before we actually finalize on a budget. But it also requires a certain amount of state legislature to actually go forward to get things pulled into the next 6 months as opposed to waiting for the July fiscal year to begin. So that's basically what happened was at the governor's office, and during his weekly press conference, he focused on vaccinations. And there's been, last week he was talking about frustration, and that frustration, of course, has continued. So he basically laid out that because that slow rollout of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, $2.4 million have been shipped, but we had only had about 780,000 administered doses. And so his goal was to get 1 million doses done by the weekend. We didn't meet that goal. Definitely, they're looking at ways to expand how vaccinations are distributed. So that list of vaccinators, Newsom and the state is looking to extend that to people who can basically administer the vaccines to pharmacists, dentists, and National Guard teams, as well as looking at opening large-scale vaccination sites. And so that would be, Dodger Stadium, Petco Park, Cal Expo. We're looking at several locations here in our county, but that's, 49ers have offered up Levi Stadium, so we'll see how that rolls out. But, meeting that $1 million dose goal, we're pretty sure we didn't meet that last week. We're probably over that this week, but it's difficult because I think there's been reporting issues, and so we're also dealing with similar, much like we had with the vaccine or with the COVID-19 testing and data reporting at the state level. We are having the same thing with the vaccine. So hopefully, the governor is working on that, and that's one of the reasons I think he didn't really have any press conferences this week, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then from the ICU capacity, the governor last week was talking about, Northern California was at 35%. The Bay Area was at 0.7%, although it's went up, 1 to 2% this week. Greater Sacramento was at 9.7%, and San Joaquin Valley and Southern California were still both at 0%, meaning, they have, they have ambulances that are waiting at hospitals, and that's one of the things that are, from a county standpoint, our county health was basically warning people about last week. And then last Thursday, the state surprisingly announced that Greater Sacramento would move out of that regional restriction to the purple tier. And even though they were at about 9.7 ICU capacity, they estimated that that capacity in 4 weeks would be at 19%. And I question those numbers, seeing what the surge of COVID-19 has been. But Sacramento went ahead and opened up about a week ago, opened up their basically went from a regional to a purple tier, which allowed outdoor dining. And I think the governor, got a lot of blowback about that. They, in my mind, that's one of the reasons why. Another reason why he didn't have a press conference this week. And then last Monday, Planning Commission approved the Block 3, the South Block 3. So that's basically the mixed-use development that's housing with housing on the top with retail on the bottom that goes along Redwood Square. So it's an L-shaped building. It's 479 units. It's about 30,000 square feet of ground floor retail. So where you're interfacing with the building at the ground floor, that would be all restaurants and other retail establishments. It'll have below grade parking. And of those 479 units, it's a mixture of mainly majority one bedroom, junior, and studios, with a certain number of two bedrooms and a very small number of three bedrooms. And so, that was approved by the Planning Commission on Tuesday, last Tuesday. Santa Clara County health officers really painted a really grim picture. They talked about that hospitals were near capacity. Three hospitals were already at capacity, and four more were near capacity. And because the increased number of deaths and a certain number of outbreaks, COVID-19 outbreaks at funeral homes, the throughput of actually handling those bodies has been backed up. And so they actually initiated basically added three 65-foot trailers, refrigerated trailers that have been put in place to help morgue capacity, because there's just not enough people to process those dead bodies. So it's very, very difficult at the hospitals, at the mortuaries, the funeral homes. So that's showing that whatever you can do to make sure that you're not spreading the virus and not getting exposed to other people who might, please do so. And last Tuesday evening, council met, and we had multiple items. It was actually a fairly late meeting. We went to just about midnight, but we started the evening with a study session on redistricting. So that's really important. We just had our first district elections in November, and so of course later this year, and was supposed to be April. It looks like it now will probably be the end of May or June. We'll be getting our census data. And part of receiving that census data will be to figure out what our new district boundaries are looking like. So council, a lot of the public showed up to talk about what they would like to see from that redistricting, whether or not it's a completely independent organization, whether or not it's a hybrid of independent, giving several final maps to council to approve. And so that will be put in place by ordinance. So from that standpoint, we get the census data. This group, and it most assuredly will not be council by itself, but it'll be this group will go off and do that, and look at those district boundaries, and then figuring out what the boundaries are for our 6 districts will be when we move into the 2022 district or election. So that will be the next step. And then we approved several things that Tuesday night. We approved a request from Related California for Block 15 disposition. And Block 15 is the city-owned property at Matilda, Iowa, and Charles. It's basically the south end of that block. The north end of that block is where Denny's used to be, and that Denny's is currently under construction for below ground parking, some ground level parking, a new Denny's, a new restaurant, and then an apartments above. But basically, what we approved from a council standpoint was allowing the developer, which is called Related California, to secure a $1 million loan for housing. And so this is part of the affordable housing, and the biggest kind of barrier to creating more affordable housing is getting the appropriate funds to build it. So it's easier when it's market rate, either when it's for sale or apartments where they know that there's going to be a general income stream. It's a little bit harder for affordable housing, trying to figure out how they make that pencil out in the long term, the project, providing appropriate services. And so one of the things that they were looking at getting was a $1 million grant from basically it's the Department of Developmental Services. And so one of the things that when we defined what that project would be, it would be a mixture of senior housing, a mixture of veteran housing, basically people that were veterans that previously homeless, and then people with disabilities. And so in order to get that Department of Development Services grant or deed, $1 million loan, they basically had to put a deed of trust signed to that property. So that was one of the things, because they haven't started construction, and in the long term the city will continue to own that property, but in order for the developer to get that deed approved, the city had to actually go through and approve that deed restriction onto the property in order for them to get a $1 million loan. So that was actually a big win for them to help try to finalize the funding structure, and that's looking to break ground sometime this fall. And then the city also received the fiscal year 2019-2020 budget year-end financial report. So the fiscal year is July 1st to June 30th. So we finally received the end of that report, and part of the delay in that, we usually get that in December, but some of the financial consultants that look at how well, one of the things that we get feedback in is how well our retirement funds are performing, how well the state retirement funds are performing, and doing all those fiscal analysis that happened. They were delayed this year, so we didn't actually look at that until January. Normally we do that in December. So we received that report, and from a positive standpoint, we had about a $9.4 million surplus, and it was mainly due to higher estimated revenue and lower estimated expenditures from a city standpoint. And we basically broke that funding, so that remaining funds, into several things. One of which, of course, was $5.8 million into the Budget Stabilization Fund, and this is basically a fund that deals with year-to-year unknowns that we'll deal with. We dipped into it a lot last year, mainly to deal with short-term expenditures related to COVID-19. So we had to put in, plastic glass into a lot of the open areas where the public can go when things were still open, but making sure even for people coming to the front desk at the planning office or at City Hall, making sure that was that was actually important to provide masks, to provide some equipment to read temperatures, wash hands, all that, at the lobbies of all of our buildings. So that was critical, kind of a first step. And so we did a lot of expenditures that way. And whatever upcoming, we expended things from our budget, funding Sunnyvale Community Services early on during the pandemic, funding, nonprofits, funding our small business loan program, our Sunnyvale Cares program. So that was some of the unknowns going in that we undertook last year. But ultimately, from that $9.4 million extra, we set aside $5.8 million to look at future unknowns. We did $2.5 million into our pension trust, and so that's to defer, depending upon how CalPERS, which is our retirement, which is a state retirement organization, but they haven't always been meeting what their requirements are, what the return is, and so in order to make up any differences for our retirement liability, we've been putting aside money for the last few years, investing that and getting a certain amount of return, better than what the state has been doing, in order to basically help us defer or basically meet any retirement benefits that our retired employees have. So $2.5 million went to that. And then there was also $1.5 million for a givable loan to Sunnyvale Community Services. And that was really important from one standpoint, because they haven't been able to do appropriate fundraising. They're looking to move to a new location right near Lawrence Expressway and Kern Avenue. Ultimately, it's right next to Sports Basement, if you know where they are. But it was basically to deal with they've been focused on providing services, providing food, providing rental assistance, dealing with the county on placing people into shelters and finding them housing, whether or not that's if they've been affected by COVID, finding them hotels. And so from Sunnyvale Community Services standpoint, they have, basically been completely focused on their effort of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and haven't been able to focus as much on moving to their new location and that build out. And so that was, I think something really positive that council and the city could do to help fund that transition to those new facilities. So that was, that $1.5 million that I think makes a big difference from that standpoint. And then let's see, and that was pretty much what we did from a city standpoint. On Wednesday, the federal and the state government revised guidelines that anyone 65 and older could get the vaccine. But of course, there aren't enough doses to go around. The previous kind of tiered order made a lot more sense, and Santa Clara County had just started vaccinating those people over 75. I know I'd heard multiple stories of people who had tried to sign up online or signed up online that weren't really qualified to get the shot. So it's added a lot of confusion, which hasn't been good as far as the vaccine rollout has really made for additional problems. Certain healthcare providers have said, okay, go ahead and sign up if you're 65 and older, Stanford and Kaiser. That being said, then it's because so many people have tried to sign up. It's like, well, we'll get to you in 3 or 4 weeks maybe. So it's very difficult from that standpoint. And then on Wednesday of last week, Santa Clara became the first Bay Area county to surpass 1,000 deaths related to COVID-19. And this is just showing that it's really affected a lot of people, not just people that have tested positive with COVID-19, who've been hospitalized, but now having 1,000 people who've died is showing that the virus just continues. So do what you can to slow that spread of coronavirus as much as possible. And then last Thursday, Biden unveiled his $1.9 trillion coronavirus economic plan, and that included $1,400 stimulus checks, unemployment benefit extension, $440 billion for small businesses, first responders, transit agencies, and then $400 billion for a national vaccination program and plan for opening schools. So, this is an ongoing question of how that vaccine rollout goes. And, his goal is 100 million shots by the end of the 100 days. We'll see how that goes. I think logistically it's how you ramp up manufacturing. And there are some things that executive orders that President Biden put in place on his first day that will basically focus on that manufacturing and how we push for that. We'll see how well the manufacturing portion, responds. But it's at least a good, it's a good signal that we're trying to do whatever we can in focusing on manufacturing and then distribution. As far as this week is concerned, Governor Newsom had no press conferences. I was actually a little surprised. I would have thought, Monday, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and so often on a holiday, the governor won't meet or might have a photo op somewhere in the state. But I was surprised. Not Tuesday, Wednesday, of course, was Inauguration Day, and Thursday he didn't have one. But there's also been a lot of controversy over the last week, and from that standpoint, of course, moving the Sacramento region out of the regional stay-at-home level, based upon projected ICU capacity was one. Even though the ICU capacity was at 9.2% and estimated to be 19.2% in 4 weeks, that capacity dropped to 6.4% early between after they moved out of that out of the regional into the purple tier. It's back at like 8.6% today, but there were a lot of concerns and a lot of questions about how in from that standpoint, from a state standpoint, you can you can see that the numbers haven't leveled out and haven't been assured that they'll be at that ICU capacity in 3 or 4 weeks. There's also been several lawsuits that happened this week. 50 restaurants and wineries in Napa joined together to sue the governor of the state for not allowing outdoor dining. And so this is an ongoing question. Lawmakers have been concerned about the governor's plan to reopen schools. So the governor wants schools start reopening in February, and there are lots of obstacles. The Newsom's $2 billion proposed plan didn't really provide extra money for public health or local governments to deal with the logistical load. The plan didn't really lay out how teachers would be vaccinated. So that was there were a lot of concerns from our state legislatures on going back to school in February. And then there's also just been a lot of questions about the data reporting on vaccinations. So the governor put forth that by last weekend we would have our first million vaccinations done in the state, but and we think we've surpassed that in another week since that was announced. But there's communication has been a big problem, and part of this has to do with there's a lot of different entities that are getting these vaccines, and so from a vaccine standpoint, the county distributes a certain number, but then there's some that are distributed by the state, and then there are separate ones that are being distributed by the federal government. And so from a state standpoint, to try to pull in all that information, they had plenty of time to prepare for it, but much like they did for COVID testing, vaccinations has been kind of a different sort of effort. And I know it's a lot of logistical effort and very, very difficult, but that I think has kept the governor from being on the stage to answer some, I'll say, tough questions from that standpoint, and trying to figure out, hopefully, there was some positive information as far as the swearing in of our new senator. So I think that was positive. So there's been some positive tweets and press releases from that standpoint, but no real press conferences. Wednesday, of course, was Inauguration Day. A lot of people spent the day watching TV and watching the peaceful transfer of our presidency. So it was really great to see President Biden and Vice President Harris being sworn in. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance, although not as much in past years. It was pretty limited because of COVID-19, so there weren't the crowds, and I think to some degree it was a little more, because it was so televised. I think it was a little more intimate, and because so many people are at home anyway, I think it's probably one of the most watched presidential inaugurations in ever, probably. Although I haven't seen those numbers, but I think that a lot of people watched it mainly to see, was it going to be peaceful? Were there going to be, protests? And there were some protests around the country, but, it was that peaceful transfer of power. It was, the different services throughout that day, whether or not it's the laying of the wreath, or whether or not there's several big events, and then of course, several some live entertainment, but I think it's positive from a federal standpoint of seeing that transition. There were multiple executive orders, some of which are the vaccine rollout, which I think will be positive in the short term. I think looking at the cabinet, it shows better representation for California, and of course the Bay Area itself, looking at several people, Nuria Fernandez from the the VTA, so CEO of the VTA is moving to work in the transportation department. So there's a lot of local representation moving into Biden's administration. So I think that will be positive from a local standpoint. Okay. And that's pretty much it for the week. There were lots of events that I went to, and you know, lots of seminars talking about how the housing funding, how different types of funding from a federal standpoint look like they're going to be rolled out, but no real details this week that we can actually basically look at applying for some of those funds. But hopefully we'll be able to get some of that additional funding as it rolls out from a federal government standpoint. So let's go ahead and move to the health dashboard. There's been lots of talks about vaccinations, and so there's a new county, from a county standpoint, there's a new SCC free vax.org. And so, the county doesn't really determine vaccine eligibility. That's being, they're just following what the state's priority phases are and the tiers. And so, of course, that has been changing, especially with the state saying, people kind of setting aside the tiers. Right now, we're still pretty much following those tiers, at least from a county distribution standpoint. And there's a few healthcare providers that have went beyond the 75, the direction of people 75 and older getting the vaccine. But there's also been some questions this week about reactions to the Moderna vaccine. So there were some negative reactions in San Diego. Later in the week, of course, it was found that those vaccines were fine, and they continued the distribution of the Moderna vaccine. And so from the county health dashboard in the sccfreevax.org, the majority of residents who have received vaccines have received it from the county, from hospitals, or directly from the county. And most of the hospitals get their vaccines from the county. Stanford actually gets their vaccines from the state. So, but if you look at the numbers of just the general number of doses that have been distributed, the county has ramped up the fastest and delivered the most doses. So that's been very positive from a county standpoint. CVS and Walgreens and the VA hospital will be getting their doses directly from the federal government. So there's been actually no reporting on the number of people who've got their first dose or second dose from the federal government portion. But at least from Stanford and the rest of the hospitals in the county itself, it has online, how many first doses have been administered, how many second doses administered, and kind of what the current lineup is as far as getting people their first and second doses. And then just as a reminder, from a vaccine standpoint, in 1A, it was phase 1A was supposed to focus on healthcare personnel, long-term care facility residents, first responders, and then 1B was mainly, is where we start dealing with county residents 75 and older, and that's been opened up. The big thing, of course, is the question about county residents 65 and older. And so some of the healthcare providers have been able to start providing that to those 65 and older. Please contact your healthcare provider. Vaccine availability is changing rapidly. All vaccinations are by appointment, and that website will continue to update as new information becomes available. And then if we go to COVID cases, COVID deaths, from a national standpoint, we're now over 24 million cases, rapidly coming up on 25 million positive COVID-19 tests, and that's over 1 million cases in the last week, which is down a little bit nationally. And we passed nationally about 410,000 deaths. And from California, we've had about 3 million cases and about 35,000 fatalities. So, things are still very difficult from from a state standpoint. Things are looking a little bit better from a county standpoint. We've had 95,000, almost 96,000 confirmed cases from a county standpoint for COVID-19. That's up over another 7,000 from a week ago, but that's actually down a little bit. The previous week was 12,000. The previous before that was 9,000, and we're back to where we were about 3 or 4 weeks ago with 7,000, 7,500 a week new test cases or new positive COVID-19 confirmed cases. And so conceivably, we've kind of seen that surge post-holiday. That might be leveling off, but we'll have to see what it looks like as we continue to move forward. We've now had, 1,100 deaths in the county. That's up over another 100 new deaths in the last week. We have 601 people currently hospitalized with COVID-19. That's down 600 from 666 from last week. So we're down a little bit with the number of people that are currently hospitalized because of COVID. And then if we look at by the city numbers, San Jose still has the most. They're up another 5,000 this week to 6,300 cases. But of course that's down from 7,300, 6,500 for the last few weeks. So there, from a county standpoint, we're kind of down back to where we were about a month ago as far as the number of weekly cases. Similarly, from Sunnyvale, we've had 4,300 cases. That's up about 400 in the last week, and that's down from 500 new cases that we've seen over the last few weeks. So things are still high. They weren't as good as they were a few months ago, but they're back to about where they were a month ago. So, please do your part in being safe. It's very risky still, and looking at the new strains of the virus, they're supposedly a lot more contagious, and as far as I've seen, there hasn't been. They still think the vaccine affects or is a positive deterrent against all the different strains of the vaccine, but testing is still going on as far as that's concerned. I continue to do a lot of advocating on your behalf. We still have weekly calls with the county health and county supervisors as far as testing. The mobile county health pop-up van will be back in Sunnyvale on Monday at Murphy Park. And it's there on the second and fourth Mondays from 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. So it'll be back on Monday the 25th. And then if you need to get tested, you can always go to sccfreetest.org to sign up, to get a reservation, to get an appointment. And there's multiple places around the county that you can get tested. The last time I got tested, it was in Santa Clara, and that of course turned out that turned out negative as far as COVID-19, but that whole experience was very positive. It's very much walk through very quickly. You get a 15-minute appointment window. That was very positive, that you could go through and pretty much show up, walk in, wait. I waited like maybe a minute in line, immediately went in, they swabbed my nose and took that, and I got that information back within 24 hours. So the county has been very good about testing and making that they've ramped up that procedure very, very good. So definitely, if you think you've been exposed, if you're out there, definitely get tested. I'm going out to get going to the grocery, going to pick up going out to pick out takeout for lunch, and so I get tested at least every few weeks if I can. Let's go ahead and talk about what's upcoming. So next Tuesday is a council meeting, and it's a pretty light agenda. From that standpoint, we'll be approving our 2021 grant program changes, and so we're basically making some changes to the grant program. It used to be on a fiscal year, which caused some issue because events where the application process was kind of mid-year, and So we're changing that to a calendar year, and we're also approving the 2021 community events and neighborhood grant program applications. And so that is basically funding that we give to neighborhoods to have block parties and all that. And I know right now it's not seen as, we don't know when we'll be able to gather together, but hoping by, August, National Night Out or other events, or other ways of kind of doing celebrations, uh, hopefully by that time we'll be able to have some outdoor events again. And so that's for neighborhood grants and community grants. And so we take those grants. We basically, a subcommittee of the council makes recommendations to the rest of council on the approval of those, and we we'll be doing that on Tuesday night. There's some smaller things on Tuesday, but then on Thursday, so next Thursday, we have our all-day strategic session. And to me, this is one of the best things that, one of the good meetings that we have on a yearly basis. One of the things that we look at from that strategic session is what our priorities are from council. And there's been some long-term priorities that we've had from a council standpoint for a while now that we ultimately might drop off the list. Not that they're not priorities anymore, but we have moved downtown. We've approved basically the new downtown specific plan, and that city line project and other projects downtown are moving forward. The city hall and the civic center modernization phase 1 has been approved. City hall is under construction to a certain degree. They're at least put the fences up and tearing up the parking lots, and the same thing with public safety additions. So that's moving forward. So there's several things that might move off of our strategic plan. And then another upcoming meeting is Monday, February 1st. Is the second meeting for the Moffett Park Specific Plan community outreach, and that's a 4 to 7 p.m. Meeting. So it starts off with a staff presentation. It then gets a certain amount of public feedback, so public can talk about their what they're interested in, what issues they have, and then ultimately it moves to council and direction from council, additional questions from council. So the second meeting is all focused on transportation and infrastructure. The first one was all on environmental, sea level rise, and then if you want to find out more information, if you want to go back and take a look at that first public outreach meeting, you can go to Moffett Park, MOFFETT Park sp.com, and you can see information that staff has collected, and also take a look at that first outreach. So that's kind of what's upcoming from a council standpoint. Let's go ahead and get to this week's weekly questions. One question that I received from several people is what's happening with Wolf Road. It's a major entryway into the city, and those streets have become progressively worse over the last year and a half. And one of the reasons the city hasn't been making changes is because there's a whole effort for PG&E to do undergrounding of electrical equipment along Wolf Road between Homestead and El Camino Real. And actually the current schedule for PG&E is to finally complete that design in February and begin construction in the spring. One of the things we didn't want to do was do major repaving, and we've done some spot patching in that area, but we didn't want to do major repaving when PG&E was just going to tear up the roads, and then they ultimately would be they have to do that repaving along that way as they tear up the road. But we didn't want to do that while construction was imminent. So that project actually extends from Homestead all the way to Old San Francisco. But PG&E has changed its schedule several times in the past, but hopefully it appears that finally they're making progress in finalizing that. So I understand the complaints. I understand that those issues, and staff do go out and do a certain amount of patchwork, but not a major kind of resurfacing, which that road really needs at this point. I've had multiple people ask about the fences around City Hall and public safety, and that's part of the Civic Center modernization. Right now, they're tearing up the parking lots um, that are next to Olive. So basically, the entrance to the city hall annex, if you want to pay your water bill, utility bill, that's still open, although you have to come in from it from All American Way. So that is still available. But City Hall, the north entrances have all been closed, the north side entrances, and they're basically tearing up the parking lots, and that's where the new City Hall will be. They're preparing trees to be moved, and so that's DPS. That's the ongoing design. DPS is still open, so if you need to get to DPS, there's still a sidewalk entrance, and you have to park along All American Way. But that construction is also going on at concurrently between all along Olive, whether or not it's the addition on the DPS or whether or not it's the new Civic Center. Molly asked, one question on everyone's mind during these trying times is when Dunkin' Donuts will be opening. People are looking towards happier times. Donuts, of course, make people happy. Dunkin' Donuts will be opening up in late February, and that's right along El Camino Real, close to Wolf Road, kind of north of that Safeway that's near there. Next to Panda Express and all that. There's also a Mountain Mike's Pizza that is right next to that same shopping mall, that new shopping mall that was created, and they're planning to open in late January, so within the next week or so. So more information on when that becomes available. Darlene asked, something seems to be wrong with the signal timing at a local intersection. I'm afraid for pedestrian safety. What can I do? And so access Sunnyvale. If you go to sunnyvale.ca.gov, at the top of the page, you'll see, access Sunnyvale, and it's a ticket system to open up any issue, whether or not it's graffiti, an issue with sidewalks, in this case, a street signal, an issue with a tree, whatever that case is, you can, I seem to open up several every week when I'm out on my runs and I see that there's an issue. Whitney asked, I know some of the school playgrounds are open, but several are not. Is there a reason this is still closed? I'd love to utilize the space and enjoyed when it was open previously. So I checked in with city staff and they're following up with the school district. I know that several fields and accesses were closed. I know that they have been open. I don't know if all of them are now open, but Sunnyvale School District did open up several in the last week, like Vargas. Those fields were closed and now they're open. So we'll see, whether or not that basically, whether or not that all the playgrounds are open. Hopefully this week. So Robin asked, I'm outraged by the devious tactics of big tobacco uses to target black communities. I refuse to let others be victims to the predatory practices of big tobacco used to profit off the suffering. Currently, smoking-related illnesses kill more black people than AIDS, car crashes, and murder combined. Since the 1960s, tobacco companies have intentionally sold menthol cigarettes at discounted prices near schools that black students attend in order to acquire new customers. The impact on neighbors, families, and friends have been devastating. I'm reaching out because I can no longer stand aside and watch big tobacco destroy my community with deadly products, and I implore you to act. Sunnyvale City Council did act. They put a new ordinance in place in November to prohibit the sale of all flavored tobacco products in Sunnyvale. And so that was done in November. We did allow stores about 6 months to sell off their current inventory, as opposed to making that ordinance immediately, imposing that ordinance immediately. So ultimately, all stores, there will be no flavored tobacco sold in Sunnyvale sometime by about June of this year, when all that basically all that comes into effect. We put that ordinance in. Well, we approved that ordinance in November, and then there's several readings of the ordinance, and then 6 months from the last reading, that ordinance does go into effect. Minkoon asks, do you have a ghost eater versus ghost writer to eat at all those yummy foods? I've been enjoying the reviews. Thank you for doing that and helping our restaurants in Sunnyvale. No, actually, I go to all those restaurants myself, and it's actually good from that standpoint because I get to interact with the workers there, the owners, and usually it's the owners that are running the majority of these restaurants. I'm now at more than 180 restaurants. We're closing in on that 200 number, but I still have lots of restaurants that I haven't made it to in the city, and so it's been an eye-opening experience for me. I do research, and if people have favorites that I haven't went to, you can go to Sunnyvale eatsunnyvale.com, and that will show the 180 plus restaurants that I've eaten at. If you have restaurants that aren't on that list, definitely send me email, make suggestions. If you have favorite dishes, especially, that's always useful because I always do a little bit of investigation before going on Yelp and other food sites on what their favorites are and what I think sounds good, and making sure that other people have enjoyed that dish. So it's not just showing up and asking, and I do usually ask the owners what their most popular dishes are too. But it's a good way to get to do takeout, support your local restaurants as much as possible, and then I'm always surprised about the number of restaurants that we have here in the city, and restaurants opening all the time. So it's positive to see new restaurants opening up, or trying new things. A lot of restaurants have pivoted under the pandemic. It's actually 10 o'clock, so let's go ahead and wrap up. Thanks for joining me again this week. As always, I'm really proud of Sunnyvale's response to the pandemic. I know life continues to be difficult for so many of us, but you really make a difference. New issues come up every day, every week, but your actions in response are really important. Wear your mask, help your neighbors, share baked goods, share fruit that you picked from your tree. Continue to build community and help others, especially during these trying times. I'm really proud to see Sunnyvale residents, pulling together and helping strangers, giving food out to unhoused people at local parks. If you're out on a walk, wave, say hello to people from a safe social distance. People really miss that safe social interaction. But Sunnyvale will emerge from this as a stronger community. We're in this together. We will get through this together. Thanks again for listening. Until next week, stay safe, stay warm and dry, and of course, as always, wear your mask. Take care. Goodbye.